Hello everybody and welcome to Greenstone's webinar on aligning global sustainability frameworks, the role of software in mapping data. Thank you for joining us. Today we are joined by Greenstone's Managing Director North America, David Wynn, and Alyson Genovese from GRI. The presentations will run for around 35 minutes and then we'll have time for 10 minutes of Q&A. Please do use the question function within GoToWebinar to ask the presenters questions as we go along, and we'll try to answer them during the session. If we don't get to answer them all, don't worry, as we plan to put together a Q&A document that we will then distribute to everyone who registered for the webinar. The slides will also be distributed to all attendees after the session. With that, I hand over to David, who will take you through what will be covered in today's session.
Great, thank you very much, Kat. So hi everybody and welcome. I'm David Wynn. I'm the Managing Director of North America at Greenstone. And I'm going to just take us through a short agenda for what we're going to be talking about on today's webinar. So firstly, I'm going to kick off by having a look at some of the global reporting frameworks and some of the key trends that we're seeing within the global sustainability reporting space. Following on from that, I'm very pleased to welcome Alyson to today's webinar. So I'll be passing over to her to talk to us a little bit more about the role of the GRI standards and some of the GRI alignment work that's going on. And then our final section will be unpicking in a bit more detail about some of the challenges and opportunities for leveraging data from multiple frameworks. So looking at the alignment opportunities and how software can fit into that as a key tool to help with that framework mapping. So as mentioned, if you have any questions, please do send them to us through the chat and we'll have time at the end to pick up those questions and also circulate them as follow-up from today's webinar. Great, so for those of you that have not heard of Greenstone before, we're a sustainability software company and we have been providing sustainability solutions since 2007 to organizations to enable them to become more responsible businesses. And through our software platforms, we provide the enterprise software for within organizations, a supply chain tool, and investor portal for investors to get ESG data from their portfolios. As well as some of the awards that you can see there, we're also proud accredited sponsors of the CDP and part of the GRI accredited software tools program. Great, so in this first part, I'm going to just pick up on some of the global trends that we're seeing within the sustainability reporting space. And we're going to have a look at just sort of some of these in detail to sort of understand the landscape a little bit more. So firstly, we can't really start a webinar in June 2020 without talking about the post-COVID climate action and talking about the current global situation. We'll then have a look at the rise of TCFD and then the role of SDGs and how that's been evolving. And then finally, we'll have a look at some of the trends in impact reporting, sustainable stock exchanges, and wrapping up on the EU taxonomy in this first part. So firstly, obviously thinking about reporting, one of the key pieces that organizations are looking at is what it means to be a sustainable business in today's global landscape. And a lot of organizations, as well as World Economic Forum, have been talking about a global reset and an opportunity for organizations to build back better in terms of how we come out of the current COVID situation. And while some organizations are in that position and are able to think about building back better, we can't ignore the fact that for many sectors and organizations, this has been hugely impactful and a fundamental reshaping of how their businesses or supply chains are having to operate within that. So for many, the idea of using these frameworks to be able to report on that is really, at the forefront of what's being looked at. So in addition to that, there's obviously a few cultural things that I'm sure many of us are feeling. So reflecting, restructure, and rebuilding being one of them, as well as an audience shift. So this concept of sort of Zoomageddon, where this digital plug for what historically has been a more face-to-face way of operating as businesses. Finally, then, when we look at things, the concept of going back to normal, what does that actually mean? Is it around a more seasonal way of approaching your business? Is it in a different way of operating? And with that, is there a need for a wider understanding of supply chains and origin within that? And finally, really thinking about purpose. So for corporate purpose, what is that balance between people, profit, and planet? And how is that embedded within businesses? So more than ever, there's a huge set of challenges and opportunities that organizations are facing based on today's current situation. Another key thing that we're seeing then within the framework space is the continued rise of the TCFD. So the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, we're seeing a continued increase in the support for that. And whilst a lot of companies are supporting it, disclosure increase is still relatively slow, but it's certainly growing. And even since the 2019 status report was published, that's been the case. If you haven't looked at this, I'd encourage you to look at the Good Practice Handbook that's been published. It's by design a good practice handbook rather than a best practice, because for many organizations, learning how to report the TCFD information and evolving that has been really fundamental. And what we're seeing as a key potential sort of barrier is particularly around the concept of scenario analysis, which is as a newer concept for many organizations, takes additional time to sort of understand and apply to your actual business. So while TCFD continues to filter through organizations as a key framework, another key framework that we're seeing continue to be used are the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar. And when talking about these, this representation of them, I often find is a useful way to present them in terms of thinking about the biosphere, society, and the economy, with Goal 17 on partnerships running through the different levels within this what's termed wedding cake structure. And whilst many organizations have been adopting the SDG approach to thinking about how their organization fits with the goals, it's really now that transition to the more target level engagement that we're seeing increasingly on the SDGs. A good example of that here, just from Johnson & Johnson, where, as well as the SDGs that they've identified as being important to their business, they've actually taken a target level approach in terms of aligning their aspirations and their 5-year targets with specific goals within that. And unfortunately, we do still see that for many organizations, the Sustainable Development Goals are perceived as just that, and those 17 colorful boxes, as opposed to a defined global framework that has targets and goals defined within it. And that's a maturity thing in terms of moving more into that space. So landscape-wise then, the fourth area that we're seeing in terms of trends within the reporting area is around impact reporting. So organizations, quite rightly, moving towards the ambition to report not only on their outputs and their activities, but more about the long-term and broader changes associated with the impact that they're having as an organization. This screenshot here is from a joint webinar that Greenstone did with Vertigo Ventures a few months ago, looking at practical steps to start measuring and reporting impact. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. And again, this moves towards a more value and purpose-driven way of communicating what organizations' impacts are. So fifthly, another global trend is the increasing move towards stock exchanges being a driver for requiring organizations to report on environmental, social, and governance disclosures and performance. This is a graph from the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, just tracking the number of exchanges that are part of that partnership. And you can see, over the last 10 years, the growth that's been there in terms of globally stock exchanges requiring listed companies to provide certain disclosures within their reporting. So finally, our sort of sixth trend and thing that we're seeing is the increased interest in the EU taxonomy. So this is the newest sort of area here that we're sort of looking at and we're seeing. The EU taxonomy, for those not aware, it's a unified classification system. So it's a piece of EU legislation. And what it does is it's looking to support organizations with defining which economic activities are considered environmentally sustainable. And the driver here being to encourage organizations to integrate ESG information into investment decisions, but also providing a common language to be able to do that. So I've taken an extract here from one of our webinars that we did a few months ago, specifically on EU taxonomy. And so here, what it's looking to do is look at the areas that an activity is substantially contributing to and the criteria that sits within that. So whilst this is very early in terms of as a framework and as a way for organizations to report ESG information, we're seeing some early interest and traction, particularly driven in the investment space, on how this will come to fruition and will be rolled out into wider reporting. Great, so quite a lot of information there in terms of some of the global trends that are going on, and we really want to sort of start with that macro approach of looking at what's going on globally. So now I'm going to pass over to Alyson at GRI, who's going to take us through some more specific information about GRI.
Great, thanks, David. Appreciate it. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So Thanks everyone for having me. My name's Alyson Genovese, and I understand there are folks from all around the world joining today. I'm our director of GRI's regional hub here in North America. I'm based in the United States, and I've been with the organization for 5 years. So we'll just get right into it. I know that many of you, oh, my screen's not advancing. There we go. Many of you are familiar with GRI as a brand or familiar with GRI standards, but I just wanted to level set for those who may be new or may not have a full picture of what GRI is about. The GRI standards is certainly our core product, but the organization does not exist to simply as a standard setting body. The reason why that GRI exists is because we believe that organizations, particularly businesses, can be a force for positive social and environmental impact, that they must be at the table. But in order to do that, in order for companies to have a sense of being able to move forward with the Sustainable Development Agenda, that they need to have a clear understanding of their impacts and where they lie. And that we believe greater transparency of this information, both internally with business leaders and employees, as well as externally with stakeholders such as regulators and suppliers and other customers, that leads to better decision making, and therefore leads to a strengthened company, but also a strengthened economy in our world. We are headquartered in Amsterdam. That's where the bulk of our employees are based and where the standard setting team is. We have about 80 employees there. And then we also have regional hubs all around the world. So for those of you who might want to get in touch with your local GRI representative, please let me know, and I can take that offline, and happy to connect you with the local, with our local team member. We are now 22 years old. When you look at the breadth, the GRI standards are used by approximately 10,000 organizations every year. Particularly when you look at the largest companies, multinational organizations, when you look at the Fortune 250 companies, 75% of them report using the GRI standards. And it's amazing to think about the 22 years ago that the idea of corporate disclosure on environmental, social, and economic impacts was seen as something that was kind of off the wall and wacky, whereas today it's seen as generally accepted and actually strange if a company's not reporting, particularly in the largest amongst the world's largest companies. We are also seeing a huge growth, and I think David mentioned it, in the regulatory expectations on organizations to disclose. GRI next on July 3rd, so I think that's next week or the week after, we'll be releasing Carrots and Sticks, which is our report that we publish every 3 years on the state of regulatory expectations for companies to disclose their ESG or sustainability impacts. And so I can certainly talk more about that if folks wish. The GRI standards are based on reporting principles. For those of you who read a lot of reports or are interested in reporting, you see that there's not a defined way that a company has to report. And that is by design. The organization should decide with its stakeholders how the information is conveyed publicly. That being said, we do want to see that the reporting principles are followed of being multi-stakeholder, being contextualized given the issues that a company deems material through their materiality assessment, that it's complete And completeness means both in terms of telling the whole story, not just the good news, but also completeness in terms of where impacts occur. So where an impact on, say, a company's water usage, for instance, we want to see it within their company. We also want to see it, how it's reported within their supply chain. And the goal, of course, with standards is that it allows for greater comparability, it's clearer, and it's objective and it's accurate. So these are the principles that when you read reports as someone who wants to digest and use this information, these are the qualities that you should be looking for. The GRI standards we have 37 standards, excuse me, 36 standards. No, 37. We added tax in December 2019. The first 3 standards are universal standards. And so every organization, whether they're a private company, publicly held, whether they're a nonprofit, a city, a quasi-governmental agency, an event, every organization that reports uses those universal standards. Through the materiality assessment that an organization goes through, they decide together with their stakeholders where their impacts occur in the most material topics. Based on those most material topics, they will use any of the 34 topic-specific standards that match up with their material topics. Generally speaking, we see organizations use about, depending on the organization, but anywhere between, say, 8 and 12 topic-specific standards may be used. These standards, it's important to remind folks that the standards are free for organizations to download, use, and publish against them. They are available in 11 languages, and translation is always something that we strive for, adding languages as often as we can. And we are constantly having updating the standards, and this new format that was started in 2016 with the GRI standards allows us to really focus in on one issue at a time to be able to make sure that they're best in class and make sure that they're the current best practice for reporting. In fact, right now, the universal standards are out for public comment. Given the time today, I won't go through our entire reporting, entire process for updating the standards, but we do always have a 90-day public comment period, and the universal standards is out now. And so I do encourage people to look at it because they're actually fairly significant changes. We've added a lot more information around disclosure and expectations on human rights, and also have made some structural recommendations. So please do weigh in and make sure that your voice is heard on the proposed new structure. So one of the things that we hear a lot, and that you may also hear, is that at the end of the day, use of the GRI standards is voluntary. They're voluntary disclosures, and there are about 25% of sustainability reports that are issued every year that don't use any sort of standard-based system. And we believe that the reason why standards exist and the reason why standards are useful is because it creates a common language for organizations. It creates some structure that, as readers and digesters of the information, that there's some reliability in terms of where information can be found and how it's structured. We also want to make sure that GRI as a neutral body can help organizations make sometimes difficult decisions on disclosing information that's important, but that might always not be great from a PR standpoint or a marketing standpoint. We really want to have companies be truly transparent and honest about where their impacts occur, both positively and negatively. And we also are, everything that is from a standard setting is that the experts are brought together and convened over a 2-year period to develop the standards. So it's not standards are not developed by companies for companies or by investors for investors, that they're really balanced. And so that helps stakeholders trust that the information is based on generally accepted best practice. Also, what we have seen is as the regulations around the world have risen on expectations for disclosure, that those regulatory bodies, whether they be capital markets or governments, they want to see organizations report against using a set of standards so that they trust the information that is coming out of particularly from corporations. We certainly see challenges in reporting. It's not an easy role within an organization. For those of you who are in charge of the reporting function within your organization, hats off to you. You have to be an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur and a influencer and a decision maker and a teacher all in the same day. But from a reporting function standpoint, you know, there remain challenges, many of which can be, I think, addressed by having a strong software system. The trust and verification and assurance of data remains a challenge, both within companies as well as, I think, as a field, if you will, as a practice. About 25 to 30% of reports here in North America are assured, and most of those are partially assured, primarily in the environmental space. So that is something that I think we'll be grappling with as a field in the next few years. Timeliness is always a challenge where organizations these are small teams, and it takes some time to pull this data together, and oftentimes the resources and the data is not readily available, and therefore reports get published sometimes in August, September, October for data on the previous year. So I would posit that, you know, getting 2019 GHG emissions data in October of 2020 is not super decision useful. It's not helpful. And so having that timeliness principle, having the report come out in Q1 of the following year is going to be necessary in order for people to trust and be able to use the data. So we've already talked about completeness. Sustainability context is another area that has gotten a lot of really valid discussion recently, because as we look to a greater demand for ESG data and data points, particularly as you look to for investors to be able to look at certain data points, the lack of context around that data can be problematic. And we need companies to tell the narrative around their management approach of issues, their future-looking strategy, who's in charge of this information, how is it managed, how is it resourced internally, as well as the greater sustainability context of what is happening around this issue, and how, as an organization, do you truly understand some of the issues that might come, that might surround our global realities today, things like climate-related migration, refugees, certainly things like coronavirus is showing that to have an eye on the larger global sustainability context is really important for companies right now. Then the last challenge that I'll speak to is differentiating reporting versus communications. So sustainability report is oftentimes seen as the primary communications vehicle for that data, which means it gets a little clunky, right? It becomes 150 pages, there's lots of children running through fields, and it might be therefore difficult for decision makers to find that data within reporting. So I encourage companies to differentiate a report versus the communications tool that helps pull out some of that data points for different stakeholders. So with that, I think I'm over time on. So I'll just quickly jump to the corporate reporting dialogue. The Corporate Reporting Dialogue is a group of 8 organizations involved in corporate disclosure, and they've been meeting for about 5 years now. And primarily its function is to make sure that the organizations are in touch with each other, and that where possible that there can be some common messaging and alignment. So about 4 years ago, they went through to try and see if they could develop one specific definition of materiality, and they were unable to do so, but were able to clarify the role of materiality, for instance, within each of the organizations, and to develop some common understanding, so which is stated here. GRI, as kind of the umbrella organization for non-financial or extra financial reporting, we take that responsibility seriously and want to make sure that we are at the table to help organizations understand how GRI works with all of these other entities. We meet weekly with CDP, we meet weekly with SASB, and have research projects going independently with each of those organizations. We're certainly continuing to meet with the corporate reporting dialogue. And one of the sub-projects that came out recently last year was a sub-project called the Better Alignment Project. And that was focused on their first publication was focused on how CDP, CDSB, GRI, all these acronyms, integrated reporting, and SASB all align to TCFD, to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this is a publication that we can provide as an attachment perhaps after this, which is a free publication that maps how these different tools help companies report to TCFD. And that's important because it's really, there's a lot of acronyms coming out, a lot of really interesting experiments in the marketplace, a lot of really interesting shifts in reporting, but we want to make sure that they're seen as interrelated and contiguous versus a competing framework or something that you have to navigate on your own. So I actually quite like this document that came out, and I'm happy to share it. It's free on our website. And then, you know, there are other alignment tools that we have available, and when we work with other organizations, all of which are free on our website, to help organizations navigate, you know, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals like TCFD, they're large frameworks, they don't have specific indicators. So you really need GRI underneath the hood to be able to accurately report on those things. So we try and make sure that these sorts of tools are available as soon as possible and free of charge. So with that, David, I'll pass it back to you. I'm not sure if I have to press something on my screen, but I think it looks like you took it back, so that's perfect.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alyson. Great. Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. It's really important and helpful to understand the role of GRI and what's going on in terms of the collaboration between the different frameworks and standards within this space. Great. Well, our final section then, we're going to dive into this a little bit more, and Alyson's teed up well in terms of talking about the alignment piece. And what we hear very often from people within the sustainability space is this alphabet soup, if you will, of frameworks and standards that companies are being asked to report using or have the option to report using, and how do they start in terms of applying those. And in addition to all of those external frameworks, of course, there's also the internal frameworks that organizations have within their own company pillars or their own company purpose and values as well. So one of the things that is really useful to understand first off is just the different role and purpose of the different frameworks and standards. We often fall victim to just talking about all of these frameworks in a broad way, and actually they're serving very different purposes, and they can be used in different ways. So we've just created this very simple graph here just to show an example of a company that was using two sets of frameworks and standards. So ones that were quite investor focused, so prescriptive questionnaires like CDP or SASB, which is providing a set of very investor focused indicators, versus others that have a broader audience. So GRI obviously is the sort of grandparent of the frameworks covering all of the different areas, but then others that also have breadth in a more thematic sense, such as the SDGs or the UN Global Compact in terms of its reach. And one of the challenges then for organizations is really, how do you bring that data together within your organization to then feed these different disclosure approaches and different audiences that require or request for that information. And I thought this was just a useful way to kind of underpin that. This is just a quote from Larry Fink. Obviously, BlackRock have been driving a lot in terms of organizations to use frameworks and disclosing information. And really, the goal isn't transparency for transparency's sake. So whilst the frameworks and standards are hugely important to be able to provide those comparable indicators and provide that information to the market, they are not a to-do list in terms of checking all of these things off. It really needs to be tied into materiality. So I would definitely encourage you, to look at that report that Alyson mentioned, where understanding what materiality means is really the foundation of ensuring that you have robust and transparent disclosure, but also from a practitioner perspective, it just ensures efficiency, that you're disclosing what people care about. So with that in mind, I wanted to just sort of highlight a few trends we're seeing within the sustainability software space. Greenstone provides sustainability software, so we really see firsthand those challenges and what the trends are within the data side. So as well as increased requests for data, just generally, we're seeing both larger volumes of data and also new data sets. So something like COVID is bringing a whole new set of requests for information about sites being closed, impacts on carbon targets, how initiatives are being impacted, to name a few. As well as that engagement with the external frameworks, we're then seeing a move towards that increased need for assurance, as well as a wider depth of understanding on scope 3 within there as well. So in terms of thinking about software side of things, these linkage documents tend to be standalone PDFs or from different places. What we've done is we've built those into a mapping library and leveraged the framework mapping architecture within the Greenstone platform. So from a practical perspective, that allows companies to be able to define those indicators that they're collecting, but then be able to cross-pollinate that information across multiple frameworks or linking it to multiple themes within the tool. So GRI and SDGs is a great example of that, where if access to land is a key goal that's linked into the business, then particular GRI indicators around that might be something that's then used to evidence that. And rather than defining additional metrics for access to land under SDGs, it's then linked within the software. I've included just a couple of examples here about practically from a functional perspective, how that might work, where you have specific indicators, as well as being able to then copy information from previous time periods through within the platform. You're then able to also see what the tags are. So by clicking on that, you then have framework linkages. So that one piece of information is doing the legwork to be linked through this matrix within the platform. Great. We'll include some links in the information that we share to some of the other webinars that we've provided. I've mentioned a couple already, and if you have a look on the Greenstone website, there are some framework-specific webinars that we've done on particular frameworks out there, and diving into how the software links into some of those specific challenges or specific frameworks. But obviously, please do get in touch with us directly if you want to explore that further in the context of your own organization. Great. So Kat, I think we've got time for couple of questions before we close out, if there are some from the audience.
Yes, we do have a few. And yeah, thank you for David and Alyson for taking us through the webinar. There's so many frameworks and regulations that companies have to report against these days. And it's interesting to hear how organisations can tackle that from a data collection point of view, and also how GRI fits into that and supports that. So that's wonderful, thank you. Yeah, we've had a couple of questions, so we've just got a few minutes to cover these. So the first question we have is, how are the GRI standards updated? Maybe one for Alyson.
Sure. So everything that the GRI does through the standard setting side is publicly available and documented. And so so there's a couple of different ways. One is that groups will come to GRI and say the information has, the disclosures have been updated. We need better information. We know more about the issue, and so there'll be a push. Other times GRI itself will decide that, it's been a long time and we need to re-examine this topic. And so we gather together, knowing we just have a few moments, I'll quickly say we gather together experts who represent, there has to be at the table, corporations, investors, nonprofits, academics, government, and civil society. So we gather together about 15 to 18 experts on the topic. They go through a tremendous amount of research and wrestle down looking at what are the indicators that organizations should be reporting on, and what are the management approach expectations that they should be disclosing. They, as you can imagine, with those different constituencies, there's lots of different opinions. It takes about 6 to 9 months to get to that place. We will then put out their draft standard for public comment for 90 days. We gather every single piece of feedback. We document it, we mark it up, go through line by line, and then we'll either make those changes. If they're significant enough, we'll put it back out for a second round of public comment. Otherwise, we have a separate sustainability standards board that oversees the process. And they will say, yes, we went through due diligence. Yes, we went through proper protocols. Yes, we had the right level of multiple stakeholders at the table. And yes, this is valid. So all told, it can take upwards about 18 months to put out a new standard or to update a standard. Most recently, our waste standard was just updated last month, and that was the first time it had been updated since about 2006. So as those of you know, been some tremendous changes in that field of expectations on that topic. And so I encourage you to take a look at it. We also put out our first new standard in December of 2019 on taxes and tax transparency. And all of this information, including transcripts and live streams of all the meetings, are found on our website.
Great, thank you, Alyson. I think we have time for one more question. If we are responding to CDP, are we covering TCFD? Maybe one for you, David.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that's a good question. If you're responding to the CDP climate change questionnaire, then you will have a lot of the content for responding to TCFD. And CDP have mapped the questionnaire to TCFD. We have that in the system because clients that are using the tool to respond to CDP will often ask that in terms of which specific indicators can be used for the TCFD disclosure, and particularly on the risks and opportunities, that information. So yeah, if you are, then definitely have a look at that mapping that's provided, and we can include that as a resource in the follow-up information that we send through as well.
Great, thank you. And there's just one more come in. This may be a quick one. What is the timeline for companies needing to start using the EU taxonomy?
Yeah, so the EU taxonomy, as I mentioned, is pretty new. The technical expert group, so the TEG, they published the report in March. I think it was around March this year, 2020. And it will be finalized in the summer. So we're not expecting a lot of changes. So if you have a look at the final technical report and the technical annex, that's pretty reflective of what should be in the final report in the summer. And then from there, the first set of technical screening criteria is in December 2021. So it's going to be over the course of the next 18 months that organizations will start thinking about reporting on that information.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're just out of time, so we'll leave it there. But just another big thank you to Alyson for joining our webinar today, and to David. And we will follow up with everybody who attended with the recording, and also follow up with some questions that have been asked during the session. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Great, thanks. Bye-bye.